Hey, WellSpring, this is the third time we're coming to you with kind of extra credit, deleted scenes, extra footage, whatever analogy you want to use, to go along with the messages from our series this summer, Following the Footsteps of Paul. You are going to want your handout if you have one of those nearby, and you're going to want a Bible. Pause this if you want to grab those too. You probably want to have that to walk through it. We're going to cover two historical bits that I found interesting, but didn't really fit in the messages anywhere. And then also one item straight out of the text that I think is fascinating. And I wanted to show that to you too, because it just didn't make its way into the sermons. So historical bit number one, if you're looking at the chronology here on the back of this handout, I want you to notice the timing. So first missionary journey, goes to Jerusalem for the Jerusalem Council, second missionary journey, third missionary journey. Then he spends 2 years in Caesarea in prison. Goes to Jerusalem, is arrested, sent to Caesarea. 2 years later, after spending 2 years in Herod's palace, so a nice area. Then he goes to Rome for 2 years in a rented house. So sounds like that wasn't too terrible, awful either. And that ended in 62. And that appears to be when the book of Acts ended. The book of Acts in chapter 28 kind of ends abruptly, probably right around there in 62 when that was finished. And then it says he was martyred in 64. We have pretty good reason to believe that it was 64 or maybe even just a hair later than that, because 64 was when the Great Fire of Rome happened. So you may have heard the phrase, Nero fiddled while Rome burned. That came out of that scene in 64 AD, where much of the city was burned. Nero was blamed for not being responsible and managing the fire. And so to create a scapegoat or diversion away from him being at fault, he blamed the Christians. Much honestly, like Hitler used the Jews as a scapegoat and a foil for his move in Nazi Germany, Hitler used the Christians as a foil, as a scapegoat, blamed them, and massive persecution broke out in 64. And it's believed that then or shortly after then, both the Apostle Paul and the Apostle Peter in Rome were both executed. Paul was said to be beheaded because he was a Roman citizen. Peter was likely crucified upside down based on legend and history. We don't have those in the Bible, but we believe that to be true. Now, the question I'm bringing up to you, the historical bit, is what happened in between the two? Because it seems like there's a gap between 62 and 64, and there's always disagreement on any of these things because the Bible doesn't lay it out exactly. It's abiblical, it's outside of the Bible. But it's believed by many, and I personally think this is true, that Paul was released in 62 and then rearrested in 64, where a short time later he was executed by Nero. Now, we don't know for sure what happened in the gap, but many think, I believe, that he traveled to Spain during that time. So Romans chapter 15, in verse 23 through 25, Paul says, but now that there is no more place for me to work in these regions, and since I have been longing for many years to visit you in Rome, I plan to do so when I go to Spain. I hope to see you while passing through and to have you assist me on my journey there after I've enjoyed your company for a while. Now, however, I'm on my way to Jerusalem in the service of the Lord's people there. And that's when he went to Jerusalem, and he was arrested there in Jerusalem, spent 2 years in Caesarea, then 2 years in prison in Rome. And I believe that when he was released in 62, he went on to Spain. We just don't have that recorded because that was after the book of Acts was written. Then he would have gotten arrested a second time, probably treated much more difficult. You'll see that some of this talk about chains. That was probably from the second imprisonment, more of a dungeon type setting, where he was then executed in 64. That's the first historical bit. Second historical bit that I kind of found interesting is you see that Romans was written, if you look on the insert, Romans, we believe, was written during the third missionary journey, which happened from 53 to 57 AD. Now, an interesting overlap there, if you flip over, that happened right about the same time that Claudius was poisoned and Nero took over as emperor. Claudius, by the way, was poisoned very likely by his wife. Whole different separate story, don't have time for that. But that happened during Paul's third missionary journey. Now here's why it's interesting on that. So in 49, and you see this we included this on the insert as well. In 49 AD, Claudius expelled the Christians from the city of Rome. We see that in the book of Acts, chapter 18, where it says Paul met a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, who had recently come from Italy, or Rome, with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had ordered all Jews to leave Rome. They saw the Christianity as just an outcropping of Judaism, so they recorded as they called all the Jews to leave Rome. Suetonius, the Roman historian, also said, since the Jews constantly made disturbances at the instigation of Chrestus, Claudius expelled them from Rome. That's from history. That's in 49 AD. Now, a little sidestep, since we're doing all sidesteps, right? A little sidestep there. The fact is, this is 19 years after Jesus' crucifixion, 19 years after his resurrection. Rome is hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of miles away from Jerusalem at a time they didn't have good communication tools like we do today. They didn't have good travel experiences like we do today. And yet, hundreds of miles away, 19 years later, Rome was astir because of the works of Jesus. This is not a legend that developed over a long period of time. We know from history this all happened very quickly. Okay, anyway, so that happened, and that was in 49. So when Nero comes to power 5 years later in 54, Nero, as a sign of goodwill for political reasons, he didn't care about these people, he said, I'm going to let the Christians come back into Rome, and he was very popular with the Christians. In fact, one of the reasons you shouldn't get too carried away about any of the political leaders, we have a history of that not going so well. When Nero came in, the Christians hailed him as a guy who was going to give them freedom and opportunity, and because he let the Christians back into Rome for self-serving reasons, and then he became one of the worst enemies of Christ probably in history. But that happened in 54 during that third missionary journey. So when Paul wrote the book of Romans, it was probably in response to, hey, we can get back into Rome. Let me send a letter to the church there, because now it's legal, starting in 54. And he was in Corinth at the time. We have that written down here. And he says in Romans chapter 16, verse 1, he said, I commend to you our sister Phoebe, a deacon of the church of Cenchrea. Cenchrea, if you look on the map, is really close to Corinth. So Phoebe was probably with Paul. Rome opens up. He sees Aquila and Priscilla in Acts chapter 18, sends the letter into Rome. All of that happened during that same time because of the socio-political realities of the world. I just think that's kind of cool. Maybe you don't. I'm sorry about that. Okay, that's the second historical bit. The interesting item in the text, and this is maybe my favorite of all of them, is if you look over in 2 Timothy chapter 4, you see in my mind, one of the coolest little verses that just you can read right past if you don't pay attention. But 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 9, Paul, writing to Timothy, says, do your best to come to me quickly, for Demas, because he loved this world, has deserted me and gone to Thessalonica. Crescens has gone on to Galatia, Titus to Dalmatia. Only Luke is with me. So you see Paul being very vulnerable with Timothy, expressing his loneliness, and he says the only person with him is Luke. Now, Luke wrote the book of Luke, the Gospel of Luke, also the book of Acts, with Paul's help. Paul wrote a number of letters in the scriptures. Together, they wrote about half the New Testament, those two just together. So they're there together in prison in Rome, and Paul's very lonely. And he says, get Mark and bring him with you to Timothy, because he's helpful to me in my ministry. I sent Tychicus to Ephesus, and when you come, bring the cloak that I left with Carpus at Troas and my scrolls, especially the parchments. So here you're going to have a meeting coming up with Paul, who wrote a fourth of the New Testament, Luke, who wrote another fourth of the New Testament. Mark is going to be there with Timothy. Timothy, two of the letters were to Timothy. Mark wrote another gospel. So all of those guys are going to be in one room having this one meeting in Paul's rented house there in Rome, or maybe even in a dungeon at this point. 2 Timothy was probably when he's back in the dungeon. And he says, when you come, bring my cloak, but also my scrolls, especially the parchments, which many people assume was a lot of the New Testament. All of Paul's letters, probably Luke and Acts were part of that gathering. So you're going to have Paul, Luke, Mark, Timothy, all in the same room together, looking at Paul's parchments, the New Testament, together. I just would have loved to have been a fly on the wall for that one. I just think that's really cool. So, two historical bits, one item in the text, all extra credit. Thank you for joining me.